Remember those colorful plastic cups we all drank out of in elementary school on birthday parties? Or that rainbow parachute game where everyone stood in a circle and raised that ginormous rainbow parachute up in the air, and then everyone just ran beneath it? Or waking up on Christmas morning ready to play with your toys as a kid? When the iPhone 7 came out, watching the old Barbie movies, Ninjago, or How to Train Your Dragon? Well, those are some of my childhood memories. But if you do remember some of these things from your own childhood, what emotions come to mind? Happiness, grief, sadness, anger? Maybe you miss those times or you resent them because you don't associate good things with them? Well, the word we're looking for here is nostalgia, a term we've probably all heard of, but associated with different things. But when we look on the internet, why is it that more often than not, we see more videos about nostalgia related to Gen Z than other generations? Is it just the fact that Gen Z is the most present generation on the internet, or could there be something else about it? Could it be that nostalgia actually hits harder for Gen Z than it does for other generations? If so, why? The world is ever changing, and nostalgia isn't just limited to one generation, right? But yet, Gen Z seems to be associated with a different kind of nostalgia. Maybe there is actually something different about it. For example, some people say that Gen Z was the last generation to actually have a real childhood outside of the internet. Although it does feel like kind of every generation says that about themselves. Millennials said that, boomers said that. But let's look into why Gen Z has a special case of nostalgia. I know you might be thinking, well, every generation experiences nostalgia, and nostalgia is different for every generation because different things happen every generation. But Gen Z is still a bit separate from other generations, and why I think that and how this could be explained, we'll talk about now. First, we'll have to define nostalgia itself. Cambridge Dictionary defines this as a feeling of pleasure and also a slight sadness when you think about things that happened in the past. So it seems like we're reminiscing about things that happened and associate them with either positive or negative emotions. Other definitions include 1. A yearning for the return of past circumstances, events, or etc., like we said, missing something, or longing for home or family, homesickness. So essentially, we're yearning, missing, or just simply remembering the past fondly. Now, why does nostalgia even exist, and when does it usually happen in life? Research suggests that nostalgia is often triggered by feelings of anxiety, fear, and rapid personal or societal changes, which makes sense. When you feel like times are changing, you might be clinging onto what you experienced as normal, your childhood mostly. What's different about Gen Z, though, is that it has come of age, meaning it's become teenagers or young adults, during a time of very rapid and very intense changes in society. Like, for example, the pandemic, COVID, we sort of talk about this as a meme, but it really changed a lot of our memories in regards to our childhood because it really was that intense of an event. Turning to an idealized past or times where things were simply better, whether that's our own childhood or something that we didn't even remember, offers sort of a psychological relief. By the way, regarding that era we never lived in, we'll talk about that later. And regarding the when, some might think that nostalgia only happens very late in life, but that's actually not true. Like I said, when the most societal and personal changes happen, that's usually when nostalgia hits, and that usually is when people come of age, when they become young adults or teenagers. You might remember that one scene from Inside Out where that nostalgia grandma character comes in, and then people say, well, you're too early, nostalgia isn't supposed to hit yet, and Riley is like, what, a teenager, like 12 or 13, I think. So essentially, I don't think they were right in that regard, because nostalgia really can hit at any time, but it's most relevant when the most changes happen, which is when you become an adult. And regarding the question why nostalgia is happening for Gen Z right now is obviously just because right now Gen Z is mostly becoming adults and teenagers. Like, for example, I am Gen Z, I'm 17 years old, and I, for myself, know that a lot of changes have happened in the past years, and I have experienced a lot of nostalgia as well. Nostalgia can also lead to a sense of connectedness, which I think we mostly experienced during COVID times, where we didn't really have that. We were sort of short on social connections, obviously, so we wanted something to connect over, which might have been nostalgia or shared memories. And remembering childhood not through the lens of just one single person, but through the lens of an entire generation leads to that connectedness. It makes us feel like we are a part of something or like we belong. Not to mention that the times that we experience nostalgia, which is the early 2000s to late 2010s, are very palpable in terms of trends. It's very obvious what was trendy at that time and wasn't divided into several micro trends, but it was sort of like a big image that we have of that time. But it also combines trends of not only that year, but the years and decades before that, and other generations' memories. We see this phenomenon, for example, in Stranger Things, which is a series that we mostly associate with 2019 or 2020, where it came out, but it actually plays in the 80s, I think, so really, we have nostalgia for a time that we didn't even experience, the 80s. So really, when we refer to nostalgia regarding Gen Z, we're really talking about other generations as well, like, for example, the 80s that we associate with our childhood, but that aren't from that time. In that context, let's talk a bit about historical nostalgia. That's that thing that I mentioned in the beginning where you have nostalgia for a time that you didn't really experience. Studies show that generations like Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z have higher records of historical nostalgia than, for example, Boomers or the Silent Generation. And although Millennials seem to be experiencing the most historical nostalgia, Gen Z is still very much affected, like the studies show. But how does this relate to our topic? Despite being digital natives, many Gen Zs express a longing for an era before the internet, before social media and that lack of real connection. This is often framed as a desire for a life with more authenticity and real connections. So part of the reason why Gen Z misses childhood so intensely is because they actually were the first one to grow up with technology, but also experience a part of their childhood without technology. So we're missing a time that we didn't fully experience, but that we only got sort of a small glimpse at, which is the period of time where there wasn't an internet. Although, of course, the internet itself, or the fundamentals, were created, I think, in the 1970s, but it really developed into what it is today in, I think, between the 2000s and 2010s, and obviously it's still developing right now. Also, for Gen Z, it's become much more accessible to immerse ourselves in the times we didn't really experience through the internet. Additionally, Benjamin Ho, an associate professor of behavioral economics, says that Gen Z has a deep longing for a simpler time because they are faced with hundreds of choices for any given decision. There are no strict rules in what to wear, what to listen to, and which celebrities to idolize, because, for example, we have the main pop girlies, which is not exactly the entire mainstream, because there's a strong movement that's really against these kinds of people, so we don't really have a real mainstream anymore. It's mostly just micro trends. So rather than turning to current trends, which are really confusing, Gen Z turns to the past, where things were much simpler, and everyone wanted to watch the new episode of Gossip Girl or One Tree Hill, which I don't really know what that is, but they mentioned that in the article. They want to experience life in a way that they never have, is what Benjamin Ho says. And this plays a bit into historical nostalgia for times they didn't really experience or only partly experienced, but I think it's mostly about the phenomenon of micro trends, which is all over the internet. People are actually warning us about them, which I think is insane.
Dressing in microtrends has become a low-status behavior.
Don't be fucking boring. This whole town is so fucking boring. I can't.
And the professor also said that we want things to be simple. Especially teenagers mostly want to fit in and be like the norm, but when we can't really define what the norm really is, it becomes really difficult to really fit in. So the end of this so-called monoculture enhances nostalgia in a way. And now for the biggest topic of them all, the internet has changed Gen Z the most. We've already gotten into how it's changed us, but let's get into more detailed facts. As I already mentioned, compared to, for example, Generation Alpha, Gen Z is much more prone to have experienced childhood without phones. For example, let's take me. I was born in 2008, which I think is a part of the more later Gen Zers, but still somewhere in the middle. And up until I was in 4th grade, which I think is around 10 years old, I didn't have my own phone. What I did have, or what a lot of us had, was a flip phone, which you might be thinking, well, isn't that like a really old invention? Well, it sort of is, but we still had that at the time. My first phone was a Samsung Galaxy something, and I didn't necessarily know how to use it, but I used it basically like a child would. I didn't have social media until I was in 5th or 6th grade, which is still early, but compared to Generation Alpha, which are like influencers at the age of 4, I think it's still late, I guess. So for a considerable part of my childhood, I did not have a phone, and thus know what it's like to not have a phone. Also, not to mention that we were much more naive in childhood. We didn't really know what everything that was going on. Climate change, maybe we heard about it, but nowadays, when you're, for example, Generation Alpha, and you look on the internet, social media, which a lot of Generation Alpha already has, you see lots of these terrible news that you wouldn't usually. So you think back to your childhood where you didn't understand all of these things, and it seems like everything wasn't as bad back then. And for Gen Z, this is obviously different than, for example, for Generation Alpha, because Generation Alpha is exposed to the internet from such an early age and thus already gets all of these bad news. Something I've also noticed through this TikTok, for example, is that movies, I think, have changed a lot. The stories seem deeper or more vibrant back then. Now, they seem sort of dull and shallow. I think that's because the industry has to appeal to people who live nowadays, children who live today, and those have a much smaller and shorter attention span. You need to keep their attention at all costs or people won't be watching the movie. And that leads to, I think, a lack of real stories. There is something deeper to be said about that, but I don't want to get into that in this video, so maybe another video. So, what can we take from this video? What's my conclusion? Regarding the question in the beginning, does nostalgia hit harder for Gen Z? I think it doesn't hit harder, but it hits differently, because we remember things differently, and we are the first generation really to grow up with technology, but only partly. Also, like I said, the invention of micro trends, which obviously were always a thing, but I think are much more prominent nowadays, also leads to a sense of heightened nostalgia. Something I also want to mention is that nostalgia can actually change our perception of childhood. Some things that we remember, for example, let's say your childhood was mostly bad or you have lots of negative experiences, you could still remember your childhood and think, well, it was pretty good. Obviously, has to do with trauma, but also with nostalgia, because sometimes we remember things differently than they actually were. As Taylor Swift said, nostalgia is a mind struck. And I believe that's the case for most of us. We blend out the bad and only remember the good. A lot of people say life gets bad when you become an adult, and for me personally, this actually makes me really angry, because I remember as a child, everything was so blurry and difficult, and I'm not saying that because I think my childhood was necessarily mostly bad, but because when you grow, your horizon grows. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. You know more, you understand the world better, you're better able to defend yourself, to cope, and as a child, you're really just helpless, and if something bad happens to you, then you're going to have lasting scars. Whereas when you're an adult and something bad happens to you, you can cope and you can deal. So what I'm trying to say with this is that don't let your mind trick you into thinking that as a child everything was better just because, I don't know, your emotions were more heightened or time seemed to be going slower. Of course, yes, there are struggles that only come when you're an adult for most people, but still. Yeah, so that was sort of my opinion on the whole topic. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd really love to know your opinion. Do you think that nostalgia hits different for Gen Z, or that everything I said is like basically bullshit, which I think is fine. This is just my opinion, what I researched and what I figured out. So if you come to a different conclusion, let me know in the comments. Alright, that was it for the video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Leave a comment, like I said, leave a like if you like the video, subscribe if you like the channel, and hold on. Okay, so I didn't actually find it, but if you didn't know, I published a book. It's a really short book, it's kind of expensive, but if you want to buy it, I lost the writing contest that I wrote it for, but if you still want to support me, then go ahead and do that. And yeah, that was sort of it. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye!